Welcome to the Boom Clap podcast where culture and conviction collide. I'm Rita Rogers.
And I'm Cecily Dickey.
All right, guys, today, before we get into this episode, we need to issue a disclaimer, and it's a serious disclaimer that you need to review this episode before listening to it with your children. We talk about a lot of heavy topics. We talk about trafficking and abuse. So you need to be aware that these topics are prevalent throughout the entire episode. So just know that going in, that you might want to be listening to this with earbuds or, not necessarily in the car with your kids. So just making that clear for you all. This is our last episode before Christmas. And I was looking at the calendar as we recorded and I was like, okay, we always end before Christmas on like a heavy topic, and so I was like, maybe we should change it to something more lighthearted, and move our schedule around a little bit. Mm-hmm. But I'm like, no, I like it this way. And I think Cecily agrees that it's good to be faced with reality going into these holidays where we're focused on very frivolous things often in Canada and in America, and realize that there are other people in the world living really hard times and that we need to be grateful. And we need to set our eyes on Jesus. And we need to help other people see that as well. Instead of being so self-focused as we often can get in our comfortable little lives in North America. So anyways, Cecily's going to tell you about our guest, Brian, in a second. But before we do that, just know we would love if you would go and leave us a review. Go back and listen to our past episodes. If you miss us over the Christmas holiday, you can catch up on those. But also just leave us a review, 5-star wherever you listen, or if you listen on Apple, you can leave us a written review. We really appreciate those, and those help propel our podcast to new listeners.
Yeah. So as Rita said in that little intro, that describing why we chose to leave this before Christmas, we need to set our eyes on Jesus, on the things that are most important, not on the frivolous things. And I don't know how many people there would be in the world that are better at directing your eyes to Jesus than the guest that we have today. His name is Brian McConaghy. He is the founding director of Ratanak International. And before that, he was a forensic scientist with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 22 years. For 19 of those years, he performed his duties with the RCMP while setting up and running Ratanak International as a volunteer. Brian is a man with a burden for the people of Cambodia, as you will hear. And there is so much more to his story, starting from his childhood, honestly, right up until the work that he is doing today. God has completely orchestrated his life and prepared him for the exact work that he is doing right now. And like I said, burden for the people of Cambodia. And Ratanak is working with girls and boys and young men and women that are being trafficked and abused in the most horrific of circumstances. And they're doing incredible work to try to prevent that and also rehabilitate. So this episode is, I don't really know how to describe it. You're going to see both of us on the verge of tears throughout a lot of it. It's just, his story is incredible. The work he is doing is incredible. And the reality of the world we're living in is both beautiful and incredibly broken. So anyway, say a prayer before listening to it that God would soften your heart and reveal to you what he needs you to see in this moment of time and in your life and how you can respond to this episode.
When we were wrapping up there at the end, you asked me if there's anything else I had to say. And I just am going to share this with the listeners. So I was like, no, I was like, it's going to get us into, I do have things to say, but it's going to get us into another area. But after we wrapped, I told Brian what I was thinking, that a lot of times anymore, we kind of hear a lot of people talking at us and telling us what to think and telling us what's going on in the world. And these are oftentimes people that aren't actually involved in any of the things they're talking about. They're just telling us. And he nodded and said he knew what I was talking about, but he is not one of those people. Obviously, he's very involved in what he's talking about. And he said, a lot of times people think that they can just hit a heart on social media or a like button and feel like they've done something and they haven't. Like that is not taking action. And so that's something else to be aware of, I think, going into this episode is how can we actually do something? We may not be able to do exactly what Brian's doing. We could give to his organization. We can help his organization. But how can we actually become involved instead of just necessarily talking about things or feeling like we're doing something without actually taking action.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that right now, because that's a great thing to have people's minds set on before they start listening to this episode.
We're in the heart of winter, and everyone's looking for different ways to support their immune system. RoCasaOrganics.com has many items that fit the bill, and you can use the code BOOMCLAP to save 20% on your order. One of the first items on your list when you go to RoCasaOrganics.com should be their elderberry syrup. They have over 1,000 5-star reviews, and in one weekend last year, they sold over 7,000 bottles. There's a reason it's a hot-selling item. It works. They have many other items for your immune system needs. Go to RoCasaOrganics.com and use the code BOOMCLAP to save 20% on your first order.
All right. Hi, Brian. We are happy to have you on the podcast with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah. So Cecily had introduced me to your story through a podcast that she heard that you did with one of her friends, I believe, that also has a podcast. And I actually, before we got on, like immediately before we hit record, you said it's better to be spontaneous. And I agree, especially sometimes when I've heard a complete story before. Sometimes I miss important parts and asking important parts that would be good for our audience. So purposely, I had started listening to the episode that Cecily had sent me, and I think I listened to about half of it. And then I stopped because I knew we were going to have you on. And I was like, I want to hear the rest of the story firsthand, so it can be spontaneous. But the purpose for having you on is twofold. We want to hear more individual, deep stories from people just out living and doing things because we think that's important. But also, we have talked about this on the podcast before, that the issues that we're exposed to and we're aware of and we discuss are the issues that we've been purposely exposed to, really, and the issues that we're told to kind of talk about. And then there's all these other things going on in the world that we just don't even know about that are equally important. And so that's kind of, I don't know, we just want to hear your story today. So to start, can you give us just a little bit, like we'll go deep, but to start, can you give us just a little glimpse of what you do? And let's start there.
Okay, real quick thumbnail sketch. I was born in Northern Ireland, and I grew up there till I was 15 through the Troubles. And so experienced a fair amount of violence and instability. My family home was stable. It was kind of the rock solid place I could retreat to, but outside the door was pretty rough. Schooling was rough for me. That led me to be a fairly shy, insecure kid. I was dyslexic. Things weren't going well for me, so I would be described as a vulnerable kid, I guess. My dad was a pastor, and he got called to a church in Canada, and so we emigrated to Canada. Emigrating, even between two English-speaking countries as a 15-year-old's never fun. It's a horrible age to emigrate. Anyway, I arrived in Canada, survived school barely. To make a very long story short, ended up with skills as a weapons specialist in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. That's Canada's equivalent of FBI, for those of you who may be in the US. It's the federal policing agency. And I had a real talent for that as a forensic scientist. And so I would be working primarily with crime scenes, autopsies, ballistic evidence, etc., and giving evidence in court to that. And that's a gory line of work, but I was good at it. I finally found what I was good at, which is a bizarre set of skills for a Christian to have, really, particularly being trained as a sniper as well. And from that, God led me into mission work that I never expected. And so we work in Cambodia, and I am dealing with a lot of really ugly stuff in terms of human trafficking in Cambodia. And I am still the insecure young guy inside that I started off being, even though God has privileged me to work on some pretty difficult and dramatic circumstances. So that's a real quick overview.
Well, that's very interesting to me, because one thing I picked up on when I listened to you on that podcast, which was I told Kyle, who's the host of that I would give their podcast a shout out, because that's where I found you, the Furiously Curious show. So that was great. But one thing that stuck out to me, even just as a listener, like I wasn't watching video or anything, I was just listening. And what stuck out to me is that you have this amazing story. You've done these really incredible things in your life that most people, it's more like a movie in most people's minds. Like these things only happen in movies. This doesn't happen in real life or to real regular people. But despite the life that you've lived, you come across as a very regular, humble person in the way you tell your story. Like you don't tell it as like, wow, this is all so crazy and this is what I've been through, but you tell it as just, this is what I did yesterday. You know what I mean? Like it's you don't do it with this shock factor. You just do it with this regular guy just telling these regular things, which I think is really unique.
I think the negatives of our lives are so often the positives God can use. I mean, growing up as a dyslexic kid and getting beaten up lots and living in fear a lot of times in my circumstances, it's really hard to be proud and arrogant. You just there's a humility that's pounded into you, and so it's really
literally.
Yeah, it's hard to stand up and be something special. No, we're called by the Lord to be humble. But honestly, I really have no trouble saying to people, none of this is about me. And I often just say to people as we're talking about projects and sometimes very complex things in Cambodia or with government policy and criminal activity and whatnot, people think I'm some kind of a hero. And I said, no, I'm just a guy who is too stupid to give up and go home.
Wow.
I mean, I've been at this 35 years now in terms of issues of human trafficking in what was the killing fields of Cambodia. It's brutal. And yet I don't take any credit for this. This is all what the Lord does. And if there was ever any doubt for me, it would be in the drama of what has been accomplished. As you say, a lot of it is like movie stuff. Mm-hmm. But constantly I'm sitting there kind of going, okay, there's no way I could orchestrate that. Like, what is God doing? That's impossible. Mm-hmm. I've had secular senior police officers say to me, that's a miracle. That doesn't happen. And I'm used to now saying, yeah, I know.
Miracles. Yeah.
So there's not a whole lot of room for any position other than humility. It's not about me. It's so not about me.
So good. And I think let's talk about that for a little bit, because God clearly orchestrated things in your life in a very specific way to bring you to where you are and to the work that you're doing. So tell us about how your past kind of led you to where you are. And we also were hoping that you would give a little bit of a rundown of how did you get involved working with the RCMP? For our American listeners, maybe even flesh that out a little bit more for them of what exactly that is. I think they think RCMP and they just think guys in their red suits riding on their horses, Canadians tend to know more about the States than Americans tend to know about
Definitely true.
us up here. So tell us a bit more about that and how this all led you to what you're doing.
Yeah, probably the easiest way is to start back in Northern Ireland as a kid. I grew up around guns. They were everywhere, and I used to kind of figure out my way home by where the armored personnel carriers were and where the soldiers were, because they kept me safe. And so often in North America, more so in Canada than in the US, but firearms are viewed as bad things by our society and certainly by the media. For me, it was the opposite. These firearms were the things that kept me safe. Wow. Police officers and soldiers carried them. These were the implements that I could shelter below these big soldiers who I now know were 18-year-olds, but I would shelter behind these guys with machine guns. That was tremendous comfort. So my whole view of firearms was incredibly positive and protective, because just like books that can be positive or negative, or anything in life can be positive or negative, firearms can be positive or negative. It depends on how they're used. They're actually a neutral. They're just an object.
That's right.
And tragically in the media, they are normally featured in profoundly negative circumstances, but they're also used to protect people. Mm-hmm. That was very much my case. So I come to Canada, and I was an academic idiot. It was really, really difficult for me in school, but I had this love for history, primarily military history. And they put me in, or I applied for and remarkably got a position in college to do a 3-year diploma in museum technology, because I love old stuff. I love antiques. And so as part of that 3-year diploma, I had internships to do, and they sent me to the Canadian National War Museum to do an internship. And there's always there's always a trade-off when God gives us negatives. There's always something else. There's the other side of the coin. There's something positive. And one of the things I discovered about dyslexia, which was my curse in so many ways, was that I have an extraordinary visual memory. And so I was put in this collection of firearms. It was about 7,000 or thereabouts, different firearms. And within 6-8 months, I had the collection memorized. I knew them all. And I could differentiate them as to where the rivets were positioned and everything. It was just, I don't even try. It comes naturally. And so this was a gift I had. And in the end, I met some soldiers and I went out shooting and I did some shooting with them just for entertainment and fun one day on the range. And I remember a sergeant getting down beside me and saying, who taught you to shoot? And I said, nobody. I said, no, who taught you to shoot? I said, nobody. He said, do you know what you're doing at the other end of the range? And I said, no, I haven't seen the scores yet. And he says, you're tack driving. You're absolutely nailing this. I've never seen anybody shoot like you. That ended up with, because I became involved with the RCMP, I ended up being able to compete internationally against US, British, Australian forces and winning gold medals as a sniper. And just, I'm good at this stuff. Gross motor skills, it's embarrassing for me as a dyslexic. I have never hit a baseball. Wouldn't know how. Like, it's an impossibility for me. Fine motor skills are superb, i.e. eye trigger finger coordination, superb. So I had this skill. And so with that skill, the RCMP came after me, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police came after me and said, we want you to become a weapons specialist. And they dragged me in as this young guy in college and said, what's your degree? And we want to hire you. I never applied. They came after me, which is unique as far as I know. And I'm up against a board of these firearms experts. And it's very much like the FBI. It's a very modern national police agency that does international work as well. And they peppered me with questions and they were stunned at how much I knew as a civilian. So I had technical knowledge as well as historic knowledge. And so they wanted me and I said, I don't have a degree. And they said, well, go get a degree. And I didn't think I was capable of it. So I said, what do you need? And they said, well, physics. And I said, I don't think I can do that. But I like history. Can I study history? And they said, with your skills, we don't care. We'll waive that. Just get a degree. So
interesting.
I went and got a degree, fully knowing that as soon as I graduated, if I could graduate, the job was waiting for me. And then with that, they sent me, as soon as I graduated, they posted me from Ottawa, which is in Eastern Canada, all the way out to the west coast of Vancouver. And now I'm this young 23-year-old going from a normal domesticated family, normal life, sort of in a young people's group in my church. Everything's stable. Now I'm by myself. I'm out on the West Coast. I'm dealing with homicides all the time and completely overwhelmed. And that's where faith kicks in. So that's kind of the policing background. I continued to do that for 23 years in the RCMP, doing crime scenes, etc.
Yeah. It's very interesting to me. And being that I'm from where I'm from, which is British Columbia, obviously a huge case that most people would know about, maybe even in the States. Rita, I think we've talked about this Robert Pickton case, right? He was the guy with the pig.
I'm really bad at remembering names.
Okay.
So
he was the guy.
I'm more of a descriptive.
Yeah, he was the guy with the pig farm. And you were...
Oh, yeah.
You were instrumental in that. So I talk about that for a second, but then I would love to get back to, like you said, that's where faith kicks in, is when you're kind of all on your own and you're facing these challenges. Because I would love for people to hear a little bit about what your faith journey looked like.
Yeah, faith becomes real, I think, and becomes more real the uglier life gets. When we're kind of domesticated and everything's easy, we're all inclined to go, oh, do we really need God? He's kind of the appendage that's out there. When things get rough, all of a sudden he becomes central. All of a sudden you have to make this real. And when the RCMP posted me out to BC and I was by myself, I realized for the first time that I could no longer live my parents' faith. I kind of grew up in a Christian home and you kind of ride on the coattails of your mom and dad. But when you're out by yourself dealing with this kind of mayhem, all of a sudden it's like, oh my goodness, if this faith is real, it better count. It better be mine, not my parents. So with Pickton, that was, it was an ugly file. He was a guy who ran a kind of a combination scrapyard pig farm. You can just imagine it was a mess. And he would process women as well as the pigs. He would pick up prostituted young women from downtown East Side, take them out to the farm, sexually assault them, and then choose the ones he wanted to kill and dismember them. And so indications are it was 49 women he had killed. And when we executed warrants on that farm, finally, I ended up responsible for his freezer contents. He would dispose of the bodies with the pigs. The pigs would take care of that. But there were parts that, sorry if this is triggering, just for listeners, there may be some of this is triggering because it's ugly. Yeah. The reason these stories I think are valuable is because there's tremendous hope in them, even though it's ugly. But so there was parts that the pigs couldn't eat or were recognizable. He couldn't send off to the rendering plant where they make glue, etc. People would notice on the conveyor belt. Oh. So human hands and feet couldn't go, and head. So that's what he was keeping in his freezer. So I ended up responsible for all of those. And this was a file that I had been doing relief and development work in Cambodia in my spare time for, 15 years already. But this file, God used very particularly to break my heart for the prostituted young woman.
Yeah.
I'm a very typical guy growing up who has not had a lot of contact with the world of prostitution. I'm the kind of shy guy walking down a street. When I see a prostituted girl, I'm looking at the ground. I don't want to make eye contact with her because I don't know what she's going to do. She can be rude. She can be abrasive. She can scream and yell at me. I just don't want to go there. I don't want that social interaction. And tragically, I now know that behavior is so abnormal for a typical young woman. That is a sign right there, if you see that, of a young woman that has been abused horribly. Or she simply wouldn't act that way. But anyway, I had no touch points with the world of prostitution until the Picton file. And it was in studying the victims that I had in my laboratory freezers that I confronted these lives in a whole new way. It was a very difficult file. The level of evil was profound. Secular police officers were describing it in terms of evil, not in terms of illegality, but in terms of evil. And there was 5 heads in particular that were of key forensic importance. And I would go in each morning to my office, and I would pull, as I referred to them, the girls out of the freezer, and I'd line these heads up in front of me and give them time to thaw, and then start work on them. And it was critical forensically that I link what had been done to them and how they'd been processed. And as I studied those victims, these are not skulls, they're heads. They're sitting looking at me. It's amazing what becomes normal in your life with this stuff. But as I studied them, I discovered that several of them were Christian sisters of mine. And I'd never gone there in my life, that same abrasive young woman on a sidewalk could belong to the Lord and could actually be living her life in faith more powerfully than I live my domesticated suburban life. That was a shock to me to discover that. There was one in particular, her exhibit number was 60013, but I never referred to them as exhibit numbers, as in normal files. Normally, you emotionally distance yourself from this stuff. This file was different. And I never knew these young women in life, but boy, I got to know them in death. And there was one named Serena in particular, and I took her head down to Vancouver General Hospital, and her head was x-rayed in an attempt to identify who this was. And as soon as they x-rayed her, the hospital knew who it was. Her head was so full of screws and plates and wires and repairs. She was recognizable to the x-ray tech.
Wow.
And so in learning about what had happened to her, I learned that this was a young woman that had been abused and used by pimps, controlled, drug addicted, as so many of them are, as a method of control. And that she, in living her faith, a vibrant little faith under horrendous circumstances, had been beaten to within an inch of her life many times, trying to protect other girls from their pimp. So she's living a life of bravery. And yet if I saw her on the sidewalk, I would have dismissed her. And God's kind of saying, okay, time to deal with reality here, Brian. Time to get serious in terms of the value of these human lives. And I remember very, very well, and this is going to sound weird, but it's the normalize things, you get used to things. But I remember packaging Serena's head up before court when I was done with the examinations finally, and I remember holding her up like something out of Shakespeare, and looking at her and saying, "Serena, I will see you later," and I will. Yeah. No one is hurting her now. No one is beating her now. She is with her Lord. She is living an absolutely wonderful life of joy that even after that life, she has a whole new existence that I can't even comprehend. And so there's joy in recognizing that the Lord can claim even lives like that the world would destroy completely. So that was the file that broke my heart for those who are prostituted. And that was a lesson I needed to learn for future work in Cambodia.
Mm-hmm. This is just, the example of God orchestrating, like no one wants to work a file like that, but it was something that God so clearly used for your work that you do now in Cambodia. That is just even hard for me to hear. I'm sitting here and it's not my first time hearing that story, like I said, because I had heard it before, but just it's difficult to handle just emotionally. But I really appreciate that you were willing to bring humanity to these women, despite the fact that everything in life had tried to dehumanize them. And I think, what a gift that in their death, they were able to have someone who refused to just call them by their exhibit numbers, but got to know them in that way. I think that's a really beautiful thing. And even more beautiful thought that, you'll meet Serena someday. And who knows, maybe I will too, if we get to cross paths when we get to heaven. So amazing. And I'm just so thankful to God for the way he orchestrates things. So tell us about Cambodia. Tell us about how you first ended up there.
Well, it was years before the Picton file. I was fairly new. I'd been in maybe 3-4 years in the police. And Vancouver in the winter is dark and wet and it's gray, depressing. And every morning I'd get up and think, okay, what's the trauma I have to deal with today? It wasn't fun. And I ended up realizing I need to just get out of here. I need to go on vacation. I need somewhere bright and sunny and full of live people. I'm going to take off and go to Asia and clear my head of all this traumatic dead stuff. But don't ever ask me to plan your holiday for you. I am no travel agent. I screwed it up fairly badly. I first went to Hong Kong because I'm a wimp. I'd never been to Asia before, but I figured I'd wing it. So I went to Hong Kong because they speak English, and I figured, okay, that's going to be easy. And it was. And then the next stage was flying to Bangkok, and I arrived about midnight, and it was about 1 o'clock before I got out of the airport, and it was chaos at 1 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't believe that city. And as part of that trip, I ended up more or less by accident wandering out to the Thai-Cambodian border. And it was, I was fairly naive. I was asked to bring a care package out to a friend of a friend, a girl I'd never met. She was working with a relief agency, and I was asked to bring a care package out, a couple of newspapers from home and some chocolate bars and whatever stuff she missed. So I said, I'll bring that out. So I'm on the bus going out of Bangkok, and there's all traffic coming the other way on the road, regular cars and regular trucks. And as the journey went on for hours, about a 5-hour trip, the trucks all started to become green, and they were military trucks coming the other way. And there was less and less normal traffic. And then the military trucks became armored personnel carriers. And then the armored personnel carriers faded out. And I'm starting to see tanks, and I'm kind of going, what on earth am I doing? Where am I going? I have no idea. And I ended up in a little town called Ratanak, and this medical team, I arrived when the town was being shelled, which was an interesting experience. And they tried to evacuate me out of there. I met the medical team I was to meet. It was a Christian and Missionary Alliance team. And they said, welcome to Ratanak. No offense, we got to spin you around, get you out of here. This is no place for tourists. Like, we figured the Vietnamese troops that had invaded Cambodia were going to roll right across the Cambodian border into Thailand as well. So they said, this could happen in minutes. It's coming. You need to get out of here. And so they're making arrangements to get me out. And I just said to them, look, don't panic on my account. I'm totally cool with this environment. And they stopped and looked at me and said, what do you mean? I said, no, I'm just relax. I'm fine with this. And as the shells explode, I said, I grew up in Belfast around bombs and shooting and whatnot. I'm a weapons specialist. This is not a problem for me. I'm totally cool with this. And they looked kind of a little stunned because I was very far from your average tourist. And so who would have thought those experiences would be what God would need? It's exactly what God had needed in terms of pre-training for me. So they said, well, if you're willing to stick around, we're all stressed. Can you help us lead morning devotions? Because we're all too stressed to do it, and help load medicine on trucks each morning. And I said, sure, I'll stick around. So they brought me into the refugee camp, and the refugee camp was a camp called Site 8. 42,000 people in there, I think, and they were basically political hostages of the Khmer Rouge, who were the world's most radical communists easily. And the fear in that camp was incredible because in order to purify the nation and purify their people, the Khmer Rouge wanted to eradicate all knowledge of Western colonial influence. Wow. The easiest way to do that is execute everybody with an education. And that's what they've been doing for years. So a white boy showing up to help, people didn't want to talk to me. They were very skittish. But I had the privilege of going to the edge of that camp right on the border where the mountain went up into Cambodia and watching skeletal people stagger out through the minefield seeking medicine and hope outside of what was then a sealed country of Cambodia and a country of torment. And I had never seen humans in that condition. I had never been exposed to that level of trauma, and we're on our radios and we're waiting for the calling of the shells coming in to evacuate at any moment. And, here I was trying to get away from murder and mayhem. And this is where God brought me on my vacation. And it was absolutely transformative. I fell in love with the suffering Cambodian people. My heart broke for them. They're a very easy people to love. And that was that watershed fork in the road where my life was to change.
What year did you say that was?
That was October 1989.
Okay.
Yeah, I would love.
Just good to know for framing, in the mind of our listeners and ourselves, like the time period.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about communism a little bit because I forget the context of it because it's been a while since I listened to the episode with you. But you had watched a documentary about that region, about communism, that you couldn't believe. Can you tell us about that? Because I really think this is an important story.
Yeah, I was out on the border, and the reason why Cambodians were straggling through the minefields trying to get out of the country to get medicine was because no medicine was allowed in the country. No food was allowed into the country. There were no transportation agreements, trade agreements, communication agreements, anything. And what had happened was they had been subjected to a horrendous civil war. The Khmer Rouge, the world's most radical communists, had won the civil war in 1975. This was kind of an appendage to the Vietnam War.
Okay.
They were a neutral country, should never have been involved, but they got sucked into it. And the Khmer Rouge take over. They institute what's known as the killing fields for 3 years, 8 months. And they were determined to kill everybody with more than a grade 3 education. And that's exactly what they set about doing. And that was because the Central Committee, although they hated education, most of the leaders of the Khmer Rouge had been educated in Paris, and they'd gone to left-wing universities that taught economic theory. And the economic theory was that basically the urban cities were the consumers, and the producer of a national wealth are the agricultural people. And if you view cities as fundamentally parasitic, the best way to create wealth for your country is to destroy the cities and all those educated, because they're the ones that consume the country's wealth. So it really is very clear Marxist principles of equality in terms of the poor peasants that earn the money and the rich people in the cities that consume it. So these young guys learned this as a theory in French universities, and then went right home and put it into action, like just straight. They had no concept of not applying this stuff. And so they're in the process of basically reducing society to a peasantry so everyone was equal. And if you were a doctor, and you could, it's basically the Cultural Revolution in China on steroids. So if everyone has to be equal, So the best way to produce that is to kill anybody who's unequal. So if you're a doctor and you lean over with compassion to help somebody on the ground, you are demonstrating your authority over them and your skills, so you're to be killed.
Wow.
So basically you have to reduce everything in society to illiterate drones or peasants that just do what they're told. They're illiterate. They can't function themselves. Then you have the perfect equality. And I find that absolutely fascinating, because in many later years, I would have the privilege, although it was terrifying, of going into the jungles and meeting Khmer Rouge leaders who could have killed me. And they were fascinated in learning about Jesus, because they viewed Jesus as kind of communist. Well, what does that mean? Well, they said, well, Jesus wants everybody to be equal, and we're really interested in this. But what's fascinating is it's the antithesis of communism, where communism reduces everybody to equal, where Christ would love everybody to be equal, but his teaching is that we raise people up to be equal. We give people privileges. We give people help. We raise people up. So yes, there's equality, but it's all done in the context of human dignity. It's the very opposite of killing them to create equality. So equality is a very dangerous thing if it's not well understood, because it can be implemented in brutal fashion if we're naive about it. So communism just destroyed that country. And yet we are made in the image of God. So even though you are raised and indoctrinated in a communist system, there is this profound desire in the bones of every human being for freedom. That is, I believe, part of the being made in the image of God. Whether you understand there's a God or not, it's there. And so to have a society that longed for freedom, it was my joy and yes, my stress to try and bring them freedom and hope. And my first project, watching this TV documentary that blamed the West for sealing the borders and locking them out and not giving them any help, I figured, okay, I'm gonna smuggle a couple of suitcases of medicine into Cambodia, and with the right medication, you can save 500, maybe even 1,000 lives if you got the right meds. So I talked to doctors, and hospitals found out, and they started to give me medication. So my plan was to smuggle a couple of suitcases into this forbidden country that was sealed. God gave me 9 tons of medication. So now I'm sitting in Vancouver with 9 tons of medication. And I mean, God didn't consult with me on this. I mean, he didn't give me any advice whatsoever. I'm just sitting here with 9 tons. How do I ship 9 tons to Asia? Like, I had no clue. But more importantly, how do I smuggle 9 tons of contraband through a UN embargo that my government supported as a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is like our FBI? This is not a very good career move at all. But it was one of those watershed experiences where I had to decide, do the oaths of allegiance I have taken to the Canadian government, to the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, to the Queen and the Canadian system, are those oaths of allegiance to trump what Christ is calling me to do? And the answer was clearly no. Christ comes first. And if Christ says you do X, whatever the fallout. And so I was quite prepared to lose my job and potentially worse. And I did it. To make a very long story short, we were able to smuggle all the supplies in. We distributed them, and thousands of lives were saved. And then, as a ironic twist, because God's got a real sense of humor, this enemy government that was a puppet government of the Vietnamese, still communist, but much less radical, who would allow us to help people, they stuck me on state-run TV with the Deputy Minister of Health doing a press conference because this wonderful Canadian had broken the embargo, and I'm trying to keep a low profile. It's not a good way to do it. So it did not go well for me in terms of the Canadian government or the RCMP when I got back, and God orchestrated the preservation of my career through other dramatic events later. But that's where it started.
That's interesting. I kind of want to hear about the other dramatic events, but one thing you said is, if God asks you to do something, that trumps, the human rulers. And this has been a thread that runs through our podcast through the entire time it's been running, is civil disobedience when necessary in the name of God. And one story that we've brought up many times is just Corrie ten Boom. And that story where her father is speaking to a pastor, and the pastor's like, well, the government says, and her dad's like, well, but God says, you know? And so I think that that's very important to pick up on. But anyway, I kind of want to hear about the dramatic events that kept your career going. Unless, Cecily, if you have something else to say.
I do too. And if you're willing to share that. But first, I would love to talk about, I don't want to necessarily say the importance of education, though I do think education is important. I think in the context of this conversation, what I need to say is let's talk about the gravity of education, because those Cambodian men that were educated in France, it was their education that really led them to do what they did, right? And for you, I think you had said the first time you watched that documentary, you didn't want to believe that the West could have had something to do with the brutality that was then introduced into Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge, probably because of your education and how you had been shaped to believe the West functioned in the world. So I'd love to hear your perspective on the gravity of education and what that can do and what it was like for you having that brought into question.
Yeah, I was happily naive. We're the good guys in the West, right? We would never participate in anything that's kind of fundamentally immoral. But as I discovered Cambodia, I ended up contacting the journalist who put together the documentary. His name was John Pilger, a very, very influential, very famous journalist outside of North America, and he's very left wing. But I grew to admire him because he had an understanding of justice, and he was appalled by what was happening in Cambodia. So I contacted him, and I basically picked a fight with him over the phone, which is kind of like you or I picking a fight with a senior older journalist like Dan Rather about, American constitutional policy. Like, you just, what are you doing? Don't do that. You're outclassed. But I didn't realize what I was doing. I picked a fight with him, and he basically shut me down and said, look, I love this conversation with you, but only after you've been to Cambodia proper, because I've only been to the border. And I disagreed with his position in the documentary that the West had created this mayhem. And I'm a young RCMP guy. Like, we're the good guys. There's no way. So it took 5 months to get into Cambodia, but I did it through Laos. There was no visas at that time through the normal channels. But I got in, and I asked all the serious questions to discover that he had actually understated it. It was worse. It was worse. And I had to confront the fact that in the West, we were the bad guys. We did not have adequate critical thinking, that we too, in our own government way, had been indoctrinated to the fact that we're the good guys, just in a more subtle way, just the way young guys from Cambodia in the 1950s and 60s had gone to Paris, and they'd been indoctrinated, and they were applying what they knew without any critical thinking. And we can do the same thing. Human beings aren't that bright, I've discovered, me included. I mean, we just do stuff, and oftentimes we don't know why. And so it was a real challenge for me to discover that he was right, and that I had something to do. I had a job to do. Jesus was saying, these people are dying. They don't have any medicine. What are you going to do about it? And I was terrified by the whole prospect, but it ended up working, and it led to years. And it ended up, I ended up leaving my career after 23 years to dedicate my life to the nation of Cambodia and what we do now. So it's been transformative for me.
So that part was really interesting for me to listen to. And I kind of want to get ask a little deeper there, or you to go a little deeper, because so my daughters and I were doing a study on the rise of communism just at the same time Cecily sent me your episode. And that part was included where you'd watch the documentary and everything. And the study we were doing talked about communist Russia and how we had throughout the Cold War essentially continue to provide aid, essentially helping communism stay afloat, because our aid made communism look a little more successful than it actually was. And so I was like, both sides of this coin are kind of interesting, because if you're not providing the aid, you're not helping the people that are being harmed by this government. But in providing the aid, you're extending the harm to the people. So it's kind of like, how do you even win,
Well, I think these are the difficult conundrums we get into trying to serve the Lord. I remember My warm, fluffy view of doing international relief and development evaporated about 4 years into my work maybe 3 years into my work in Cambodia, when because all the doctors and nurses and public health workers had been killed and all the hospitals destroyed, and there's no lawyers, there's no engineers, nobody was left that was educated. We were trying to rebuild medical services from little thatch huts. The first clinic I encountered served 20,000 people, and it was probably a 9-foot by 9-foot thatch hut.
Wow.
With 2 stinking jars in it with some kind of fluid. Don't know what that was. That was it. So we started to try and rebuild after this incredible genocide, where out of a population of 7.5 million, 3.2 million had been killed.
Wow.
So the psychological condition of the country was horrendous. And so the Civil War is still on, but I specifically wanted to go places where others wouldn't go. I wanted to work in areas of the country that were dangerous, where the society had been abandoned and they were suffering, and the Khmer Rouge were close by. They had been kicked out of power by a Vietnamese invasion. The Vietnamese rescued Cambodia from itself, and it is absolutely true. Cambodia owes its life to Vietnam. It was a good call. It was a moral call, what they did. So the Vietnamese troops are still fighting the Khmer Rouge, and we build clinics, and some of them within weeks after building these brand new clinics, I run around Canada and I raise all this money and everybody's happy and these Christians are helping me out and we're going to build these clinics, and we do 10 clinics, I think. And within weeks, some of them were blown to pieces, like blown to the point where the concrete slab is there, everything else is gone, like they're destroyed. And there was one clinic in particular that impacted me because there were kids inside that clinic and there were kids died. So all of a sudden, you're kind of confronted with, well, wait a minute here. If I wasn't doing this, those kids would be alive. Does that land on my lap? Am I responsible for their deaths? Like, all I'm trying to do is help, but people can die as a result of this. So often the actions we take, while they're well-meaning, and they may even be totally correct, there are consequences. And we have to be very clear that this is not easy stuff. There are compromises to be made. There is suffering to be done. I tell people who work with Cambodia all the time, he who learns to love Cambodia learns to grieve. And you do. There's a cost to all of this. So the nice, easy black and white of the world is that's gone for me. Like, things are much more nuanced. They're much more complicated. And that basically forces us to get on our knees much more and say, Lord, how do I navigate this? Because in every right answer, there's issues that are difficult. In every wrong answer, there's issues that are wonderful. Like, and how do you navigate all this? Yeah. And that requires a great deal of wisdom and accepting some of the fallout that does come.
Oh, man. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's with anything. Like, when you go deeper and learn more, it's just not everything is black and white. And I think that's one thing that is so lacking in society as far as an understanding, because everybody wants to just cheer something on super loud or boo it like super loud. There's no middle ground and no conversation. And so that's very powerful. While I believe the doctor's office can have its time and place, I am so thankful for the ways that I have learned to take care of my family's health at home, and for the tools that I have in my toolbox, as I call it, to help care for my family when they're sick. One of those tools that I've put in my family's toolbox is homeopathy. And one of the brands that we trust is Remedy Collective. We have their first aid kit, which has a guide with a list of problems that I can go to decide what remedy I want to use. And the first aid kit has a bunch of remedies that cover almost all of the problems that we will encounter. It's been so helpful for our family to have. If you're interested in learning more about homeopathy and possibly getting a first aid kit for you and your family, go to remedycollective.com/boomclappodcast and use the code boomclap to save 10% on your order. Another thing I wanted to bring up, just based on like the time we were doing that, is so interesting that we were doing this study and then I was listening to that episode with you and it was just like kind of lining up. But one thing that they talked about when we were doing that study was just the fact that, all of these communist dictators and things, there was much more death even in a lot of instances than the Holocaust. But Americans, we study the Holocaust and talk about it all the time. Not that it shouldn't be talked about and not that we shouldn't know about it, but we don't talk about communism as much. And the rationale they gave, which I believe to be true, is that a lot of our educated, elite, liberal colleges are communist sympathizers in some ways as far as their teaching. So kind of back to the beginning of the conversation, that we talk about the tragedy that is put before us within our education systems and within the news media. And a lot of these other tragedies and things going on in the world, like what you're dealing with, we don't even know about. We're not even aware of.
Yeah, I don't generally focus on any particular political label, because I think that can sometimes cause us to miss the point.
Yes.
I think these regimes, whatever the regimes are, where they go off the rails is when we choose to make ourselves God.
Yes.
If we try to run things and make ourselves God, we're in trouble. And obviously that's classic for communism, but there are plenty of dictators that do the same thing. If we are not humble before the Lord, then we've got a problem right off the bat. And so for me, given my background and my history as a kid, getting beaten up and being very much the underdog, when I encountered Cambodia, I encountered an entire country of underdogs who had been tormented by geopolitics, by domestic politics, by revolution, by genocide, by multiple invasions, by being the most landmined country in the world, when all the ability to find mines was gone, when the doctors who could deal with amputees were all executed, and on it goes. And then the AIDS epidemic kicks in, courtesy of Western tourists who can eventually arrive, and they don't even understand why they're dying. There's no doctors there. They have no education. And on it goes. There's trauma after trauma. And I'm seeing in that really the human condition. That's the human condition. What's the solution for the human condition? The solution for the human condition is, okay, there's a Lord Jesus Christ who would die for us. We are to die for. And what a joy it is for me now in our work with so many young women who have been sold into slavery, and kids too, in the Cambodian context, to be able to communicate to them that they are to die for. It's my favorite expression. To die for is not a purse. It's not a new car. It's not anything material. To die for are people. They are to die for. And that's exactly what's happened. If we can realign ourselves to the prostituted young woman and actually grasp the fact that she is to die for, that transforms how we view those around us and how we live. And I think in our wealth in the West, we struggle to do that. We struggle to cross those barriers because we have basically spent our lives, oftentimes in a Christian context, building a very careful cocoon of comfort around ourselves.
Yep.
And it's not to be found in the New Testament. It is absolutely not to be found there.
Yeah.
The New Testament calls us, if anything, to suffering. It calls us to do heavy lifting. It calls us to care for people that are other than us, that are difficult cases to work with, not the people we like. We're called to love our enemies. Like, what does that look like? Really? So really, I mean, in all the revolutionary teaching that the Cambodians have been exposed to, the most revolutionary teacher is Christ.
Yeah.
Who breaks all the barriers and says, you are to die for. That's revolutionary. That's the kind of revolutionary I want to serve. And it has profound impact on lives when they suddenly discover they're precious. And we need that. Well, they need it in Cambodia, but we need that in North America too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That is so powerful. That was so powerful. Thank you for that. So let's talk about, I guess, how your career and how you ended up, leaving your career and fully investing yourself. And if you can include like what happened, those dramatic things that led up to that. But then lead into the work that you do now. Maybe tell some stories along with that. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I basically, it was interesting. God first broke my heart through the pig farm and Willie Picton for prostituted young women. I always thought the RCMP and being a forensic scientist and a weapons specialist was going to be my career. It turned out it was only training.
Wow.
It was only training for what I'd really need later. So right after the Picton file, I was working with Vancouver City Police. It was a joint task force, so I wasn't normally working with another police agency, but on that file I was. And so I'm working with them every day, and they say, we've got another file. It's unrelated to Picton, but it's a guy who's going to downtown East Side, which is kind of Skid Row of Vancouver, and he's picking up prostituted women, not to kill them as Picton did. Same neighborhood, he's picking up the young women, but he's bringing them back to various locations where he can torture them and video his torture sessions. Ugh. And they were so desperate for their next fix that they would agree to be tortured. I mean, absolute tragedy. That's how desperate they were to get the next fix. And he would video this stuff. So they arrest him, they find him, they arrest him, and he's got, I think it was 67 victims, something like that, videoed. And this is real live medieval bloodletting torture stuff. It's brutal. And they said, hey, we've got 7 little prepubescent Asian girls in these videos. We don't know where they are. Can you look at these videos? Well, decades of homicide had not prepared me for what some adults can do to children. There's pretty much, there's worse things you can do to a child than kill them, I now believe. It's awful. So I agreed, and I didn't know what I was letting myself in for. To say it's heartbreaking is an understatement. Corrosive stuff that you never get out of your head and you have to live with. But watching those files, they had asked me to determine what country these kids were in, because I'd been doing relief and development work in my spare time. And all these videos were inside rape cubicles. There was no museums, no street scenes, no scenery, nothing to, just little, all inside like small rooms. And to make a very, very long story short, they gave me the file on Friday afternoon. By Tuesday morning, I think it was, I went into a senior VPD officer and I slid a piece of paper across the table for him. And I said, there's the GPS locations of the rape cubicles and there's the names of the kids. And he just stared at me. And he said, Brian, we just asked for the country. And he said, you ever believe there's a God? And I just said, yeah, I'm functioning on that premise. And he was confused by that answer. But it was absolutely miraculous what had happened. They weren't good investigation skills. God gave me that on a silver platter in something that they've done TV shows on. It's miraculous. This is just a miracle that I identified these locations and kids. That was my wake-up call. When it's overwhelming and you don't want to do it and you don't think you can survive a process, if God's in it, God does the heavy lifting. This was not about me saving the lives of kids in Cambodia. This was about whether or not I was brave enough to agree with God when God says, these are my kids. Are you going to participate or not? Because they're his. And he absolutely, I've discovered God is an amazingly good investigator. He finds evidence and shows it up in ways that are absolutely miraculous. And so am I prepared to partner with him? Do I trust him enough to screw up my courage and say, okay, I'm in. This could destroy me, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so he did miraculous things. We set up an investigation team. We went to Cambodia. We actually got cooperation from the Cambodian police, which took some doing. We executed warrants in child brothel districts. And these are districts that at that time were run by an ethnic Vietnamese community it was wholesale mass production rape of children, prepubescent children. And I had on several files, I had senior investigators, very hardened sexual offense squad investigators in tears. They had never seen anything like this. How on earth do you go into that environment as a Christian? It's devastating. And yet we not only were able to get the evidence, and we did a whole bunch of files that led to convictions of Canadians tracking these kids and physically destroying them. Those guys went to prison. But in doing that, I was now on streets with these munchkins, cute little kids, and confronting them face to face. It's not a TV show I can change the channel of now. Now it's real. They're in front of me. And tonight somebody's going to rape them again. What am I going to do about that? And without evidence, you can't rescue them. They are product at that time that belonged to the Vietnamese mafia, just to be used as product. And so how are you going to rescue them under those circumstances? So one of the things that I partnered with a couple from California that started an organization, and we started working in that community. And it's terrifying working in a community like that is run by criminal elements. And I, as a member of the RCMP, bought child sex hotel from the mafia. There's not too many members of the RCMP who have done real estate deals with the mob, but we did it. We pulled it off. We bought this place. It was 5 stories, and we converted it into a clinic and a school and a church right in the middle of the brothels, right smack in the middle of it. And the kids were not used during the day, other than they were trained and used as thieves. But other than that, they ran wild during the day, and then they were to be abused at night when the tourists would show up. And so we would run vacation Bible schools for them, and they would learn their Jesus stories and their choruses, and they had a ball, an absolute ball. And they were becoming Christians while still being abused. We didn't have evidence to rescue them. Now, if you want a moral challenge, just imagine being in an environment where you're telling kids sincerely and honestly from the bottom of your heart that they are loved by God. He cares for them. They're adorable. They are profoundly valuable. He would die for you, knowing full well a couple hours later, some guy from Germany, from Nebraska, from Switzerland is going to rape them, and you can't stop it. And that happens every night. How do you share the gospel in that context? How do you have any kind of meaningful, it was a real struggle for me. How do you say to a kid, you're loved by God, and then that happens? How does God exist in the context of that kind of evil? And it was an amazing experience for me to discover that my questioning, if I can put it this way, I could best describe it as I irritated God. That was the sense I got. And it was like he was indignant that I would ask the question. How dare I question him and what he does? He can work with these lives under any circumstances. There were 2 little girls that I got to know quite well. They got to trust us. They didn't trust many Westerners, but they got to trust us, obviously. We were good to them and kind to them, and they knew it. And as I got to know these 2 in particular, I remember asking 2 of them in another one of these watershed conversations for me, where is Jesus when men do bad things to you? And they were stunned by the question. They thought it was the most ludicrous question. And they just looked at me and said, well, Jesus is in the rape cubicle with us. He holds our hand. And the look on their face was like, you're an idiot. Why don't you know this? And it was my first experience of realizing that when these little munchkins became Christians, they were far more mature than I was. They were the teachers. I was not the teacher. They were teaching me about faith. And this, obviously I had to deal with that. Like all of this, you go back to your hotel room and you weep and you process and you try to interpret, where is God in the middle of this? What does this look like? And what became very, very clear to me is that these kids have managed to separate the circumstances of their life from their quality of relationship with the Lord. And we generally, as North Americans and Westerners in general, do not have that ability. And hopefully not offending some of your listeners, but let me speak against prosperity gospel.
Please do.
Honestly, I can't stand it. I see it nowhere in the Bible. We have this sense of, even those of us like myself who don't like prosperity gospel, I have to admit, I kind of subtly am. And we all use this language around church. If the mortgage is being paid, your marriage is going well, and the kids haven't gone off the rails, and everybody's healthy, well, what do we say to each other? Well, the Lord's blessed you. You're being blessed. Well, what happens if your marriage is falling apart, the mortgage isn't being paid, and your kids are ill? Does that mean you're not being blessed? Have you done something wrong? Are you being punished? What does this mean? So what do you say to a child that has been sold and is 9 years old and is assaulted 10, 15 times a week sexually? What's their life worth? Where are they in relation to the Lord? And And I discovered that they have a capacity to understand the Lord loves them no matter how ugly life gets. That's a maturity I wish I had, so that I can hang on tenaciously to Jesus even when life falls apart. One of the things my very wise mom said to me when I quit the RCMP, because I walked away from the RCMP a year and a half before pension, which is financial suicide. But when you're staring at kids' real life in front of you, all of a sudden the pension becomes pretty irrelevant. These kids needed help. So I was going to quit, but I was worried about it. I'm not stupid. So I talked to my mom, and my wife, we have two young Cambodian boys that we had adopted. So we've got a 50% Cambodian family, and I had a mortgage to pay, and I'm walking away from a career and pension. I said to my mom, look, if this goes wrong, I can end up living under a bridge in a cardboard box with my family. Like, how do I navigate this? And she said something very wise to me that I don't think a lot of mothers would say. And she said, well, you have to determine whether or not this is God's call on you. Because if it's your own romantic Irish, I'm out to save the world, then walk away. But if this is God's call on you, and you end up in the world's eyes not being blessed, but if you follow his call and you end up living under a bridge with your family in a cardboard box, that is where the Lord will bless you. Wow.
Yeah.
We don't hear that in the pulpits too often, but it's absolutely true. We are to be where the Lord wants us to be, whether it is easy or whether it is hard, whether it is, quote, blessed, or whether we would view it as tragic. If we're where he wants us to be, that is exactly where we will be blessed by him. And so there's all kinds of struggles associated with this ministry as I still navigate things. And yet the kids of Cambodia have taught me much about spiritual maturity and trusting in Jesus no matter what.
Yeah. Man, I'm struggling. Just the words that come to my mind, like, because the fact that they can separate that is amazing, but still they're enduring so much. And it's just 3 words come to my mind is just come, Lord Jesus, right? Like,
oh yeah, I have shed. I mean, my concept of North American masculinity got blown out the window years ago with this stuff too, in terms of, males not supposedly crying. Like, wow. I got rid of that a long time ago. I weep about this, and I have learned that weeping and tears is this wonderful gift the Lord gives me, both males and females, when we cannot express, whether it's good or bad, when we cannot express our experiences of life, God gives us this precious, precious language when words are not enough, that we can communicate in tears. And scripture tells us he values those, that he saves our tears. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. They are that special. And we can think of marriages and birth of a child, and even Christmas time sometimes of wonderful family reunions. People cry because it's overwhelmingly good. We also cry when it's overwhelmingly bad. It's any circumstance where there's just too much. Words don't cut it. This is a wonderful language God has given us. And I think particularly in male Christian culture, we need to get over ourselves and learn that is an appropriate thing to celebrate before the Lord and weep before him. And I've done plenty of it, dealing with the circumstances of Cambodia and grieving for them. And in this weird way, I view those as precious times. One day I'll talk over later with the Lord, because he's saved all those tears as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
Very good.
So, Rita, do you have anything?
You can go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, what does your work look like in Cambodia now?
Yeah, it's progressed a lot. We very quickly got involved in the much larger trade. But the work was very successful with prepubescent young girls and boys. We did a bunch of successful investigations. That's now independent work. We no longer fund that or work with that. We moved on to the 15-year-olds and up. That's massive. And the typical model is a girl from a poverty-stricken family. They can't pay the school fees for her little brother and sister. And so she very bravely, at the age of, let's say, 15, 17, whatever, gets on a bus, travels down to the capital city to get a job in factory or a nanny's job or something. And so she can send money back to her family. Now, these girls, I have tremendous admiration for. They're brave. They're innocent country girls, largely uneducated. and they come down with hopes of helping their family. So I do view them as noble. But they get off the bus and they're greeted by traffickers and pimps and mama-san and organized crime. They're outclassed, and sometimes within 48 hours they're turning tricks. And they're just they have no options. They're just snapped up. They're just cannon fodder for this industry. And so often they can't even call their mom and dad and tell them what's happened, because if they've lost their virginity, their conservative rural family will reject them. So now you can imagine the isolation. There's not only the trauma of what's happened to you and the fact they're not paying you, they're using you, but you can't even go back to mom and dad and pretend that never happened. Like, you can't tell them what went on. So it's devastating and isolating. So that's kind of where we started with young women in that category. We had a home for them for rehabilitation, etc. But then we started to get more and more information that they were being not only sold domestically, but they were being sold overseas. And if there's one thing worse than being sexually abused and used as a sex slave in your own country, where you at least understand the language and have rights to be there, it's waking up in another country where you have no rights, you're illegal, you don't know the language, and the same thing's happening to you. You don't even know where you are. And so we started to get information about these young women, sort of phone calls coming in. Hi, my name's Xiao Yun. I thought I was getting a nanny's job in Phnom Penh, the capital city of Cambodia, but they gave me a thing called a passport. I don't even know what that is. And then they put me on a plane, and now I'm in some other country. And I was introduced to a guy, and he was introduced to me as my husband. He's 58. He's raped me 20 times in the first 48 hours, but I don't like him, and I make that clear, and I try to fight him off. And so he's got fed up, and he sold me with 17 people in his neighborhood that have raped me already. By the way, can you get me out of here?
Wow.
Like, it's devastating. How do you even start? Well, where are you? I don't know. What country are you in? I don't know. I mean, it's do you have papers? No, they destroyed my papers. So wherever they are, they're illegal. And China is the biggest problem because of one-child policy and gender preference for like 70 years plus. They are now 35 million females short. You talk about messing around with a society. Anyway, so with 35 million females short, all the nice, the good-looking, the tender, the lovely, the wonderful men, they all have their girlfriends and wives. We're left with the bottom of the barrel. We're left with the deviant, the criminal, the violent, the abusive, the horrible guys. That's who these girls are being sold to, because when you have that kind of a need, that sort of a disparity societal wise, that's a massive recipe for human trafficking. And the Chinese and Vietnamese and Cambodian criminal elements are very happy to fill that need. And so they ship young girls in who are thinking they're going for jobs. Sometimes they think they're going to be married to a lovely man who will care for them and send money back to their family. Either way, they get off the plane and have their documents destroyed, and they're done. They're done. So we started getting information on that. And because we'd built relationships with the Cambodian police for so many years, who did not have a good reputation, let's put it that way. I'll be delicate because I'm being recorded. But it was difficult stuff. But we had good relationships with these guys. So we asked for meetings, and they said, yeah, we're getting the phone calls too. We're getting this information too, and we're really concerned about it. And I'm thinking, wow, 10 years ago, you wouldn't have been concerned. 10 years ago, you'd have been selling them. Like, so we're starting to see the moral compass develop. It's really exciting to see how the police were starting to do their job. They were reforming. They were post-killing fields, post-genocide, post that trauma. They were starting to rebuild normal structures, which was really exciting. Anyway, so the big shocker was they said, we want to send a delegation to China to negotiate for undocumented young women to get them home. Now, anybody who has traveled through China knows that you don't even do a plane transfer in China. You actually need an entrance visa and an exit visa just to transfer the flights.
Wow.
They control it tightly. Movement is something they own. So we're going to go there and we're going to negotiate for completely undocumented young women. Well, we did. In fear and trembling. I don't have trained lawyers or negotiators, but we did it. And if I've learned anything over 35 years of doing this, it's just, if God opens a door, walk through it. And chances are, the more scared you are, the better positioned you are. Because I find, I don't know about you guys, but I find if I've got skills and competency and training and I go into a difficult place, what do I rely on? My skills, competency, and training. If I go in out of the box where I'm completely panicked, I don't know what's going on, I'm just trying to serve the Lord and I don't have the skills, what do I rely on then? I rely on the Lord. It's actually a much cleaner process, although it's much more terrifying. So anyway, we had the privilege of participating in China's first bilateral agreement to get undocumented young women out. They now have what they call a laissez-passer, which is a temporary passport. We can get them out of the country back to Cambodia. When we bring them back, they go straight from the airport to our rehabilitation center or our evaluation center, and it's a center that's custom built. We had an engineering architect team from 6 different countries who developed this wonderful six-story building that doesn't feel institutional inside. It feels homey, but it's designed to protect young women from killing themselves, give them privacy, but not so much privacy that they can endanger themselves. And we now have staff of close to 80 that care for them in terms of trauma care, medical intervention, helping them with their police investigations as to who trafficked them. And then the key is reintegration back into family. Because a girl, typical girl, she leaves for a 6-month contract or a year job in the capital to be a nanny. She comes back 10 years later. So she left at a 15-year-old. She's now back 25. That's 10 years of slavery overseas. She's coming back as a totally different young woman. And the family has no idea how to cope with her trauma. So we work with the whole family, reintegrating them so that she is safe in the community and giving their lives back. And the most exciting thing for me, when you've been sold as a piece of garbage to be used overseas or domestically, is to be able to communicate to them, you are precious. You are of profound value. You are to die for. And we've done the same thing with males. Males shockingly suffer worse in terms of what they're exposed to. And they come back completely broken. But we have a program for males too, that we can bring them back. We had one young guy who was sold as a slave onto ships, and he was 20 years watching executions and beatings and slave labor and torment. And he got close enough to shore after 20 years that he jumped and he swam for his life and he got to shore. And he's in our program. So, I mean, we're dealing with slavery that's of historic proportions. It's not, when I use the word slavery, I don't use it lightly. It's real life slavery. And in that context, we can pull lives out and give them hope. So it's really exciting, but really stressful work.
Sounds like it. I'm going to say something that for some people listening, they might think it's offensive, but I mean, there's a lot of anger, obviously, towards like the history of the United States with slavery, obviously. But a lot of people that condemn that slavery, as we all should, they do things like watch pornography, which is a huge contributor to the modern day slavery that we're seeing in massive numbers that, if I'm not mistaken, actually dwarf the slavery of the past. And so can you speak a little bit to that, about how people have somehow separated these things in their mind and can have what they feel is this righteous anger about one thing that happened in the past while contributing to a great evil that's happening right now?
Where do I start? That's kind of a bottomless pit in terms of the places I could go with that. I think we do have a capacity to compartmentalize life, and it's easy to feel grief and speak against a historic ill because it actually doesn't affect us. It actually doesn't impact our lives. We can be on the moral high ground and actually not do anything. It's much harder to do the same thing when it's happening around us. Now there's responsibility. Now, okay, you can't just say the words. What are you going to do about it? And so human trafficking and slavery is huge. You're right. There are more people enslaved today than there ever have been. The North American transatlantic slave trade to the Caribbean and North America is but one slice of slavery. There's plenty of it to the Middle East historically, Asia, even in West Coast North America with First Nations. Like slavery is a human condition when we make ourselves God.
Right.
That's what happens. I mean, it's horrendous. When we make ourselves God and we dehumanize others, that's where that comes from. So what do we do today in terms of the challenge of human trafficking and slavery? Well, we have to start honoring people. Mm-hmm. Prostitution is one area, pornography is another area, where we have to start taking it seriously. I mean, it's interesting to me, maybe about 7 years ago, I was in a department store in the cosmetic section, and they have these ads of, the models up with all the makeup done, and they're very beautiful. And this kid looked about 11 in this advertisement. Mm. And I took pictures of those advertisements, and it drew attention to the staff, and the staff came over and said, you can't take pictures of the advertisements. I said, well, I mean, this is a minor being dressed up, highly sexualized, to sell cosmetics. And it was a main department store we'd be familiar with. And I said, as a department store, you should be ashamed of this. This leads right into the thinking that feeds pedophilia and the abuse of children. And anyway, I got kicked out of the store. Wow. Isn't it interesting that I would get kicked out of the store for raising that question when in actual fact they have highly sexualized pictures of minors up that's acceptable? Wow. So I think we have to be very, very smart. One of my favorite illustrations of that is the front cover. I use it in PowerPoint presentations all the time. I've got a picture of a cover of the Cadou magazine, which is the French language Vogue. And there's this gorgeous kid, all made up, highly, highly sexualized. And she's 9. She's 9. And we accept this stuff. We walk past newsstands. We don't disagree with stores. We allow ourselves to accept that and then wonder why we're creating a society of men who are stimulated by minors. So it's the thin edge of the wedge. I mean, human trafficking in its pure form and prostitution and the abuses, everybody can kind of go, oh yeah, that's wrong. But we are complicit if we allow our society to accept that kind of stuff as normative. It's not. It's grotesque. And it creates problems. So we have to, I think, train our eyes to look at the advertising. And if we see stuff on the TV in terms of advertisement or in billboards or whatever else, take the time and be diligent citizens and figure out what is the corporation that's using that 12-year-old to advertise in a sexualized way. Call them and say, why are you doing that? Now, if one call comes through, it's not going to impact them. If they get 500 calls, and of course, we all know the marketing statistics, for every one call, it actually represents 30 people or whatever that feel the same thing and haven't called. So if a corporation gets 500 calls on a series of advertising, I think it was Calvin Klein and whatnot, there were some years ago, was a lot of pushback on some of their commercials and how they were objectifying young women and young men. We need to be doing that. We need to be saying, this is a human being. How dare you exploit them? It's exploitation. But what it does is it trains our minds to accept that kind of objectification. So we have to be smart, not just in the grotesque things of actual human trafficking. The day-to-day domestic things, we have to have standards because that's where it starts. And I think we're doing a miserable job of that. And so it leads to the objectification, like in Cambodia, when you strip away the moral compass and you run an entire nation through the killing fields and genocide and you traumatize them, you end up with an environment where there's a lot of social confusion, a lot of poverty, a lot of desperation, and kids get sold. That's the worst case scenario. But we are all on that slippery slope. There, but for the grace of God, go we all. If we don't maintain standards to care for human beings, those we like and those that are easy, but also those that we would consider enemies, we need to love them. Even if we disagree with them, we need to love them as we disagree with them, not condemn them.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously we need to wrap it up soon, so I'll try to keep this short. But your focus is on the people of Cambodia, as it should be, because that's where God has called you to.
Yeah.
What do you know about trafficking here in North America? Obviously, North Americans are complicit in international trafficking problems. Yep. What do you know about children being victimized in North America?
Yeah, I don't study it, but I'm aware of it. I've got my hands full with Cambodia. But on the North American perpetrator side, North America is big in the international sex business in terms of guys going overseas. I did a conference a while ago for travel agents, and I said to them, look, if you've got customers who are consistently going to a single location like Bangkok to play golf every single year, and they're not bringing their wives, I'll show you a predator.
Wow.
And they looked sort of amazed at me. And I said, no. If you're interested in playing the golf courses of the world, you're going to go to a different golf course every year. If you have one guy who apparently does not own a factory in Bangkok, who is there every year to play golf, he's not playing golf.
Right.
So we need to be much wiser in terms of the travel habits of North Americans and what they do. That's very, very real. And I've dealt with those files and the grotesque results of those files. In terms of what happens in North America, I can speak more clearly to the Canadian context. The most vulnerable category of young women we have in a Canadian context are First Nations. Those communities are vulnerable at the best of times. And so those are the girls that end up hitchhiking highways and whatever else. And they end up with Willie Picton dismembered in freezers, getting swallowed in prostitution, etc. And again, just for the record, I make zero differentiation between human trafficking and prostitution. They are the same industry.
Right.
Prostitution is not a career choice. It is not sex work. I hate the term. It is abuse. It is institutional controlled abuse. And so this whole spectrum, we need to get a much better handle on in terms of, as churches, as Christian communities, as people of faith, putting our money where our mouth is and basically saying, if this is wrong, what are we going to do with those uncomfortable girls? How are we going to help them? How are we going to make eye contact appropriately, particularly for males? We got to be very careful how we interact. But how do we as a church community really love these young lives? Recognizing it's going to be ugly. God does not call us to easy. God does not call us to nice. He calls us to bring salvation to lives that are broken. That's going to be ugly. So I would say on the social level, in the skid rows of our cities, with the drug addicted, with lifestyles that frequently when I encounter Christian communities, I would characterize how they respond to alternative lifestyles as not strident. We disagree with you biblically in terms of your lifestyle. We're actually scared. We're scared of them. Those lifestyles, be they transgender or whatever else, are scary to us. It's hard to love people when we're terrified of them. But in actual fact, they need to know the love of God. Not to say everything's fine, you carry on as is. We need to identify sin where sin is sin, but we need to be very careful to be compassionate for broken lives, to care for them, to love them, to understand where they're coming from. That is the heavy lifting we have to do in North America. That is profoundly uncomfortable because it is frightening. And what do we do with the drug dealer who comes in and sits in the back pew of the church? What do we do with him or her? What do we do with the trafficker? What do we do with the prostituted young woman that is just, she doesn't look like she fits here? I did a fundraiser some years ago, a big gala, fancy event, and I was speaking at it, and this very sort of significant businessman came to our fundraiser to rescue women from prostitution in Cambodia, and he came with an escort. Like, you're just kind of going, what are you doing? What part of this don't you get?
Wow.
So it's right in front of us. It's right in front of us. And he was so inspired by our work. He said, can I organize some, I do parties at my house where we have pool parties and we sort of gather around and the girls come around with hors d'oeuvres within their micro bikinis and serve, and we can raise money. And I'm kind of going, what part of this aren't you getting? We're so, in our society, we're so indoctrinated into what's normal that we don't actually know what's normal in terms of respecting the dignity of human beings. So that's where it starts for all of us, is how do we honor and care for those around us, irrespective of how broken they are? And it's a very tall order, but it's what Christ requires of us, as we see in John 4, when he visits with the Samaritan woman at the well. That is one powerful story.
It is.
She is condemned. She is rejected by society. She is alone. And he identifies her lifestyle, but he very specifically does not condemn her. He doesn't even identify her lifestyle as sin. He simply says, I see you, because her lifestyle, 5 husbands and the man you're with now is not your husband. That was all because she was an abused woman. If you look at Jewish marital law, she had no choice to be married. She had no choice to be divorced. That was all males controlling her. And so she had no ability to say to the man she was with now, marry me. He was quite happy to get what he was getting from her without marrying her. And Jesus says, I see you. And just seeing her and honoring her, she was transformed and she became the first evangelist to the Samaritans. Mm-hmm. Absolutely an irrelevant, rejected young woman, because of one conversation where she was honored. She goes in and says to the people, come and see the man who told me everything I ever did. And then the shocker, they listened to her.
Yeah.
The one who was rejected is now being listened to. She moves from an irrelevancy to use modern terms, a social influencer because of one conversation with Jesus, because he honored her.
Yeah.
There's a lot to learn there, a lot to learn.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rita, is there anything else you want to add before we hear about his organization?
No, I do have a few things, but I think that I better not. I better just let us go to his organization.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So tell us about your organization, the name, how people can support you guys.
Yeah. This is very dear to me. This has become the center of my life. The organization is called Ratanak International, Ratanak. It's named after a little 11-month-old girl who, in that very first documentary, was filmed, I think, about 15 minutes before she died. And there was something profoundly charismatic about that kid. Years later, when I talked to the journalist, and I said, there was this one kid, he said, I know who you're going to say. It was electrifying to watch her fight for her life. There was something about that kid. So she's long dead. She didn't get to be 1 year old. That was 1989. And yet her legacy is huge. I often think her family's out there somewhere. I'll never find them, but her legacy for that nation is huge. Yeah. So it's named Ratanak International. To learn more and to see what we do, go to www.ratanak.org, Ratanak. You can fund us through the website. Unlike some larger organizations where if you ask where the money goes, we say Africa. Well, no, it's very specific. We can answer you. If anybody ever wants to email us and say, where's actually the money going? We'll tell you very precisely where it's going, right down to the buildings and the communities. So we have the privilege of now providing rehabilitative care for young women that have, my goodness, jumped out of moving cars to escape. We had one climb into the sewers of, it was either Shanghai or Beijing. How bad does it have to be for you to climb into the darkness of a sewer with no expectation of ever getting out? Yeah. We don't know how many die doing this. Wow. But we have her. We've had one more recently who was kept as a sex slave in an apartment, and she finally figured, I'm dead anyway. So she exited the apartment out the 8th story window. So, I mean, every single one of these young girls and young men that we have the privilege of working with, every single one of them are a movie. Mm-hmm. Every single one of them, you could hand the script to Hollywood writers and they'd say, no way, it's fiction. Right. No, it is incredible. But we as Christians get to live Zephaniah 3, for those of you who may be familiar with Zephaniah, my favorite book in the Bible. I will bring you home. I will give you honor. I will give you joy. In every land where you were put to shame, I will restore your fortunes before your very eyes, says the Lord. That's what we do. And that's what we get to see every day. So I would encourage you to read the 3rd chapter of Zephaniah. It's wonderful. So really, it's about taking a country that was shattered and over 35 years seeing transformation, but particularly now working with young enslaved, both males and females, and seeing them know that they have value. Now, obviously, not all of them become Christians in our care by any means. Our job is not for the result. Our job is to present to them that they're valuable before the Lord. And then, like any other ministry, it's whether or not they accept it. That's their call. Mm-hmm. But we know much joy as we see those discover that they are precious before the Lord. And that's what it's really about. And it's exciting. It's very grassroots. We don't have any government funding. Canadian government has tried to fund us. They want to. I refuse, which is very counterintuitive. But I've told them, senior government officials in the capital in Ottawa, that we serve the great physician. Mm-hmm. And so if I'm to receive government money, I'd have to downgrade the Christian component. And they said, yeah, we know that. But can you not just do all that great rehabilitative stuff and restoring these lives? We see your success. It's tremendous. We want to be a part of it. We want to celebrate that as a nation and as a government. Can you just do that and just leave off the Jesus part? No, that's not a negotiable.
Yeah.
And so it's all privately funded by individuals. And if any of the listeners would or viewers would love to jump in, we'd love to have you jump in. And as we transform lives together, this is like Wilberforce in the 19th century. We are changing slavery in this nation, and it's really exciting.
It is exciting. Wow. And I feel like when you said like you refuse that government funding, makes me want to clap, because I mean, what we're seeing right now is, you know, in Canada, and I'm sure in the States, private schools, Christian schools, who are compromising on their own beliefs and value systems just to maintain that funding. And so to see something done really differently, I respect that to the highest degree. So highly recommend you guys. We're going to link to Ratanak in our show notes as well. So you can go and check that out and hopefully contribute to the amazing work they're doing. Maybe even you have community that you can share this with, share the work that they're doing, maybe even your church, right? Like just send this out to as many people as possible, because you're a person of character, Brian, and the people that you work with are people of character, and the people that you are working for, like you said, they are worth dying for. So we appreciate you and the work that you do.
Yeah. And don't let me leave you with the impression that I know what I'm doing. I don't. I'm terrified normally every day of what I do. I'm just trying to follow Jesus. And in that context, he opens doors, and he gives us success that amazes me every day. So there's no room for pride or like this is what he does. Ratanak belongs to Jesus, absolutely. And all the Cambodian staff, it's 100% Cambodian staff doing this now. Young people that have their own issues, but they've learned to serve their people, and they're thriving on the fact that Jesus loves them and they want others to know about it. So it's exciting.
Amen. Great. Amen to that. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today.
All right. Thank you. Blessings on you both. It's been a privilege.
Okay, what a way to wrap up this fall on the Boom Clap podcast with that interview with Brian. Incredible, truly incredible. And we're looking forward to bringing you more stories of people doing really amazing things. Coming up in January, we already have a full month of content planned for you guys with really incredible guests coming up that we cannot wait to share with you. So Merry Christmas to all of you. Happy New Year. We're going to see you January 8th. And don't forget to listen to past episodes while you're waiting for the Christmas season to pass by and you're waiting for the Boom Clap podcast to return. Listen to some episodes that you may have missed or re-listen to some of your favorites. Don't forget to share them with friends and family. Maybe that could be part of the Christmas gift. Be like, hey, here's my gift. Also, listen to this episode. It's part of your gift. So please share that with family and friends. Subscribe, follow, rate and review if you haven't done that. We would sincerely appreciate that. And you can consider that a Christmas gift to us, honestly. We would truly appreciate that. So thank you for listening today. If you want to find us outside of the podcast, you can find us on Instagram at Boom Clap Podcast, or individually, I'm on Instagram at Cecily.Dickey, or my website, thegracetogrow.com.
And you can find me, Rita, at RitaRogersCo.com or Rita Rogers Co on Instagram. Thanks for listening.